John was assigned to a remote unit right after graduating from West Point. He served with distinction, quickly rising through the ranks. By the time he was 30, John had attained the rank of lieutenant and was reassigned back to West Point, this time as an instructor teaching military strategy. It was a prestigious position, one that filled him with a sense of accomplishment. However, being addressed as Lieutenant Miller by cadets barely younger than himself felt strange, almost comical at times. "So, Lieutenant Miller, any lucky lady back home waiting for you?" one cadet boldly asked during a break, his voice laced with playful curiosity. The question, though expected, caught John off guard. A wave of melancholy washed over him. "You guys know how it is," he chuckled, attempting to appear nonchalant. "Married young, got a son, almost 5 now." There were a few good-natured groans and whistles from the group. John envied their carefree spirit. His own heart felt heavy with a longing for the simple joys of family life he'd left behind. The warmth of home, his son's infectious laughter, his wife's loving embrace. Every other weekend, John would make the long, arduous journey back to his family. 40 miles felt like 1,000 when covered on a rickety old bicycle, the only means of transport he could afford. It would take him the better part of Saturday just to reach their doorstep. He'd pull up to their small house, the familiar sight of his son's excited face peering through the window, erasing the fatigue of the journey. "Daddy's home," the little boy would squeal, his joy echoing through the house. And Mary, his wife, her gentle smile radiating warmth, would welcome him back with open arms. Their reunion, though short-lived, fueled him for the week ahead. Looking back, John often wondered if their whirlwind courtship could be classified as love at first sight. Their relationship had unfolded with the same urgency and precision he applied to his military strategies, swift, decisive, and all-consuming. He had first encountered Mary at a send-off party for a group of young men from their town, all about to embark on their own West Point journeys. Fresh out of the academy himself, John was back home visiting family. He was immediately drawn to Mary's quiet beauty and kind eyes. One of the recruits, a nervous young man named Alex, approached John, seeking advice. "Lieutenant Miller, sir? I was hoping you could give me some pointers," he stammered. "About West Point, I mean." John, always eager to help, readily agreed. Little did he know that this chance encounter would lead him to the woman he'd eventually call his wife. Alex's family lived a few miles out of town, and as fate would have it, this was John's first time visiting their farm. Alex's family welcomed him with open arms, especially his mother, a woman whose hospitality knew no bounds. She fussed over John, insisting he stay for dinner and showering him with questions about West Point. As the evening progressed, John found himself captivated by a young woman who entered the room with a tray of freshly baked cookies. She was petite and graceful, with warm brown eyes and a shy smile that lit up her face. It was Mary, Alex's older sister. "And this is Mary," Alex's mother announced proudly. "She's training to be a kindergarten teacher. Can you imagine? Such a tough job, dealing with all those little ones, but Mary has a real knack for it." She turned to Mary, her voice filled with concern. "You be sure to tell the lieutenant about those army men you take care of." Mary blushed, her cheeks turning a delicate shade of pink. "They're just children, Mama," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Not soldiers." "Oh, honey, you know what I mean," her mother chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "All those rough-and-tumble boys, I bet they remind you of their lieutenant here." John found himself inexplicably drawn to Mary's quiet charm. "I hear kindergarten teachers have to be tougher than drill sergeants," he said, his lips curving into a smile. "I wouldn't last a day in your shoes." Mary finally met his gaze, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "I doubt that," she replied softly. They exchanged addresses that night, a formality they both knew would lead to something more. Soon, letters filled with longing and shared dreams began to crisscross the miles between them. John found himself cycling for hours, pushing his physical limits just to steal a few precious moments with Mary at her college dormitory. 23 years old and head over heels in love, John was ready to move mountains for Mary. She, in turn, was touched by his unwavering affection. Having grown up in the rural South, she had always imagined her life unfolding within the familiar landscapes of home. After graduating high school, she'd started working at a nearby farm, teaching kindergarten to the children of migrant workers. She'd always dreamed of earning a formal teaching degree, a dream that finally led her to enroll in a community college a few hours away. But meeting John had changed everything. Now, with only a few months left before she was due to return home, her heart ached at the thought of leaving him. One cool evening, as they walked hand in hand along a moonlit path, John stopped, his hand gently grasping Mary's shoulder. He turned her towards him, his eyes searching hers. "Mary," he began, his voice husky with emotion. Words failed him. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a hesitant, questioning touch. Mary, her eyes closed, her breath catching in her throat, waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The kiss, once tentative, quickly deepened, a whirlwind of longing and desire consuming them both. John's strong arms encircled her, pulling her closer, his touch igniting a fire within her. Mary, overwhelmed by the intensity of his embrace, found herself swept away, her initial resistance crumbling under the force of his passion. "John, wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. But the words were lost in the heat of the moment, drowned out by the symphony of their desires. Later, as they lay entangled beneath the pale moonlight, a wave of guilt washed over Mary. She had always prided herself on her self-control, her ability to make rational decisions. Yet, in John's arms, she had lost all sense of reason, surrendering to a force she couldn't control. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the stars above. John, sensing her distress, cupped her face in his hands, his gaze filled with tenderness. "Mary, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. She turned away, burying her face in his chest, her tears soaking through his shirt. "John, I don't know what came over me," she choked out, her voice trembling. He held her close, his hand gently stroking her hair. "It's okay, Mary, it's okay," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm to her troubled soul. "I love you. I want to be with you always." Mary lifted her head, her eyes searching his. "Do you really mean that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He sealed his promise with a kiss, his lips lingering on hers, conveying the depth of his love. That summer, church bells chimed, announcing the union of John and Mary. Dressed in a simple white gown, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, Mary walked down the aisle towards the man who had stolen her heart. Her mother, tears of joy streaming down her face, whispered a silent prayer for her daughter's happiness. John, standing tall and proud in his dress uniform, couldn't take his eyes off his beautiful bride. John was brought back to reality by a slap on the shoulder. "Lost in thought again, Lieutenant?" Peter, a fellow instructor and close friend from his academy days, grinned at him. "Thinking about the little lady?" John smiled, his heart still warmed by the memory. "Something like that." "You look like you could use a drink," Peter said, noticing the wistful expression on his friend's face. "Come on, let's grab a beer at the officers' club. I hear they got a new bartender, pretty as a picture." John hesitated. "Maybe another time, Peter. I've got a lot on my mind." His thoughts drifted back to Mary, a pang of guilt piercing through the warmth of his memories. He longed to be back in Willow Creek, holding his son, feeling Mary's hand in his. "Come on, John," Peter pressed, his tone laced with concern. "Don't tell me you're still pining over that teacher. You've barely said 2 words all day." He nudged John playfully. "Besides, you gotta check out this new bartender. Linda, her name is. Smokin' hot, I hear. Might just take your mind off things." John couldn't help but smile at his friend's persistence. He supposed a drink wouldn't hurt. All right, he relented. "1 beer? But that's it." The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke. John scanned the room, his eyes landing on the woman behind the bar. Peter wasn't exaggerating. Linda was stunningly beautiful, with long dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a figure that could launch 1,000 ships. She moved with a confidence that radiated an alluring aura. "So this is the famous Linda, huh?" John commented, raising an eyebrow at Peter. "She's definitely not your typical small-town girl." "Told you," Peter grinned, nudging John with his elbow. "She's from the city, came here to escape the rat race, or so the story goes. Got a bit of a mysterious past, which just adds to the intrigue if you ask me." "Mystery or not, I'm a married man, Peter," John reminded him, though a flicker of curiosity sparked within him. "Relax, John," Peter chuckled. "Just admiring the view. No harm in that." They made their way to the bar, taking a seat at a corner table. Linda approached them, her smile as bright as the neon sign advertising cheap beer specials. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice husky and alluring. John, struck by her beauty, found himself at a loss for words. It was as if she had walked straight out of a movie. A stark contrast to the quiet, unassuming women he was accustomed to back in Willow Creek. He could understand why Peter had been so eager to introduce him to her. "John?" Peter prompted, noticing his friend's dazed expression. Yeah, just a beer," John mumbled, averting his gaze. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something dangerous about this woman, a hidden spark beneath her charming exterior. "Make that 2, Peter added, flashing Linda a winning smile. "And keep 'em coming." As the evening progressed, fueled by alcohol and Peter's boisterous laughter, John found himself drawn into Linda's orbit. She was a skilled conversationalist, weaving tales of city life and lost loves with a captivating charm. He knew he should resist, that he had a loving wife and son waiting for him back home, but something about Linda, a dangerous allure hidden beneath her beauty, pulled him in like a moth to a flame. He couldn't deny the physical attraction either. Linda was a woman who knew how to use her charms, her every move, every touch, a calculated seduction. It was a game John knew he shouldn't play. A game he couldn't win. But as the saying goes, a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do, right? After that night, John felt a strange shift within him. The familiar routine of his life at West Point, the camaraderie with his fellow officers, even the satisfaction he derived from teaching, felt dull. Each evening, as he walked the familiar path to the training grounds, a sense of emptiness gnawed at him, a longing for something more, something he couldn't quite define. The image of Linda, her lips curved into a knowing smile, her eyes holding a promise of forbidden pleasures, haunted his thoughts. He tried to shake it off, to focus on his work, on the letters he wrote to Mary, filled with forced cheer and exaggerated accounts of his uneventful days. The first night, he tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The second, he sat up in bed, staring into the darkness, a cigarette dangling from his lips, the smoke curling towards the ceiling like phantom tendrils. By the third night, he could bear it no longer. John found himself drawn to Willow Creek, not to his family's cozy home, but to the crossroads, the bar where Linda held court. It was a short walk from the base, barely a mile, but each step felt weighted with a mixture of anticipation and guilt. "What am I doing?" he thought, his pace slowing as he neared the crossroads. "I'm a married man, for God's sake. What if someone sees me?" But the urge to see Linda, to lose himself in her intoxicating presence, overrode his reason. He rationalized his actions, telling himself he was just going for a drink, that he'd leave after one beer. "Just one beer," he repeated to himself, his hand reaching for the door handle. He pushed open the door, the familiar scent of beer and cigarettes washing over him. The bar was mostly empty, the only light emanating from the neon beer signs and the glow of the jukebox in the corner. Linda was behind the bar, wiping down glasses, her back to him. She turned as the door creaked shut, her blue eyes widening slightly as she recognized him. Her lips curved into a slow, seductive smile, highlighting the full, inviting shape of her mouth. Well, look who it is," she purred, her voice husky and inviting. "Lieutenant Miller." John cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. "Hey, Linda," he mumbled, taking a seat at the bar. "Can I get a pack of—" He trailed off, realizing he didn't even know what brand of cigarettes she stocked. Linda leaned forward, her gaze lingering on his, her smile teasing. "Don't tell me a big, strong army man like you needs me to fetch his smokes?" He shrugged, forcing a chuckle. "Guess not. Just a beer then, whatever's on tap." "Coming right up, Lieutenant." Linda retrieved a chilled mug from the cooler, her movements fluid and graceful, every gesture a subtle flirtation. John couldn't help but watch her, captivated by her every move. She placed the beer in front of him, her fingertips lingering on his for a moment longer than necessary. A jolt of electricity shot through him. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" Linda observed, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Not exactly the life of the party, huh?" John shrugged again, unsure what to say. What could he possibly talk about with this woman? Military tactics? His lonely life at the base? He couldn't bring himself to brag about Mary, his beautiful innocent wife, to this worldly, seductive creature. "I hear you have a pretty wife," Linda said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. Peter tells me she's a teacher. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him, as if Linda had somehow peered into his soul, exposing his secret desires. Missing her, Lieutenant? Linda pressed, her eyes locking onto his, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. Is that why you're here? Trying to forget? No, I'm not, he stammered, his voice trailing off. He couldn't lie to her, not with those piercing blue eyes staring right through him. Linda laughed, a throaty, seductive sound. Relax, Lieutenant. I'm just messing with you. Sit down, have a drink. Keep me company. It gets pretty lonely around here, you know? John hesitated for a moment, then pulled up a chair across from her. He knew he should leave, but something about Linda, a dangerous mix of vulnerability and seduction, held him captive. They talked for hours that night, covering a wide range of topics, from Linda's wild escapades in the city to John's dreams of a simpler life. He found himself confiding in her, sharing things he had never told another soul. John felt a strange connection with her, a sense of intimacy that both frightened and excited him. As the night drew to a close, Linda leaned forward, her eyes sparkling mischievously. You know, I could use some help around here tomorrow. Early shift. Maybe you could come by, lend a hand? Sure, John blurted out, his mind reeling. Yeah, I can do that. What time? Come around 7, we'll have breakfast together. John left the crossroads that night, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. As he walked back to the base, Linda's words echoed in his mind, we'll have breakfast together. It sounded so casual, so intimate, as if they were a couple who had been doing this for years. And what then? He tried to push the thought away, but it kept resurfacing, like a persistent weed in a well-tended garden. He knew he was playing with fire, risking everything he held dear for a fleeting moment of pleasure. But something in Linda's eyes, a vulnerability hidden beneath the layers of bravado and seduction, kept pulling him back. Weeks turned into months, and John found himself caught in a web of deceit and desire. He continued to see Linda, stealing moments whenever he could, justifying his actions with increasingly flimsy excuses. He told himself it was just a fling, that it meant nothing, that he would end it soon. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. One afternoon, a letter arrived, addressed to him in an unfamiliar handwriting. It wasn't from Mary. John's heart skipped a beat as he ripped open the envelope. Inside, he found a short, scathing letter and a photograph of a toddler, a boy with John's dark hair and Mary's gentle eyes. The letter was from Linda. She had discovered his true identity, his wife, his son. And she was furious. So, Lieutenant Miller, the letter began, its tone dripping with sarcasm. Or should I say, John, playing house with your sweet little wife while you sneak around with me? Pretty impressive juggling act. But the game's over. Linda went on to detail her plans, a chilling revenge plot that threatened to destroy John's life. She had drafted a detailed account of their affair, painting John as a manipulative liar who had taken advantage of her. She threatened to send it to his superiors at West Point, to Mary, to anyone who would listen. John's world crumbled around him. His career, his marriage, his entire life hung in the balance. He had been so caught up in his own desires, so blinded by Linda's allure, that he hadn't considered the consequences. Now, he was facing the devastating fallout of his actions. Rain lashed against the windows as John sat slumped on his porch, the letter clutched in his hand. He felt a cold dread wash over him, a sense of impending doom. The sound of the rain mingled with his son's laughter, a cruel reminder of everything he stood to lose. He had to stop Linda, had to find a way to reason with her, to beg for her mercy. But how? As the first light of dawn pierced through the darkness, John made a decision. He called a cab, his voice shaking as he gave the address Linda had included in her letter. Willow Creek, please, he said, his voice barely a whisper, and hurry. The cab pulled up to a small, well-kept house on a quiet street. An elderly woman, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, was tending to her flower garden. Excuse me, ma'am, John asked, approaching her cautiously. Could you tell me where I can find? He hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. I'm looking for a woman named Linda. She lives around here. The woman stopped weeding, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Linda? She repeated, her voice sharp. Linda who? John swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Linda. Linda Williams. The elderly woman pursed her lips, her gaze flickering towards the house across the street. That's Linda Carter you're looking for, son. Lives over there, in the blue house with the white picket fence. But she doesn't go by Linda anymore, calls herself Catherine these days. Catherine? John repeated, confused. The woman nodded. Something about a fresh start, I reckon. Moved here a couple of years back with a little boy. Keeps to herself mostly. Not much of a talker. She paused, her eyes narrowing again. Why you asking about her? John mumbled something about being an old friend, thanking the woman before hurrying across the street. His heart pounded against his ribs, a drumbeat of anxiety and fear. He had pictured Linda's house as a dark, seductive lair, a reflection of her personality. But this house was the epitome of small-town charm. Cozy, inviting, with a porch swing gently swaying in the breeze. It felt wrong. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. No answer. John tried again, this time pressing the button for longer. He could hear faint movement inside, the sound of footsteps approaching the door. Just a minute, a woman's voice called out. The door swung open, revealing Mary, his wife, her eyes red and swollen, her usually cheerful face etched with worry. John stared at her, his mind reeling. What was she doing here? Had Linda sent for her? Mary? He whispered, his voice barely audible. What are you? John! Mary gasped, her eyes widening in shock. What are you doing here? John stumbled back, his mind racing. He had imagined a confrontation with Linda, a tense, bitter exchange of words. He had not anticipated this. I came to see Linda, he stammered, his gaze darting around, searching for an explanation, for an escape. Linda? Mary repeated, her voice trembling. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. She doesn't live here anymore, John. This is my house. I moved here a few months ago. John stepped inside, his legs feeling weak, his mind struggling to grasp the situation. The house was warm and inviting, decorated with Mary's signature touch, hand-painted flower pots on the windowsill, a colorful rug brightening up the hardwood floor, a framed photograph of their son smiling down from the mantelpiece. It was everything he had longed for, everything he had betrayed. But the letter? The photo? John stammered, his words disjointed, his thoughts fragmented. Mary's face hardened, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. The letter? What letter, John? He fumbled in his pocket, retrieving the crumpled envelope. This letter, he said, his voice barely a whisper. From Linda? About the baby. About us. Mary snatched the letter from his hand, her eyes scanning the words, her face draining of color. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. She told me you were dead, John, she whispered, her voice breaking. She said you died in an accident, that you never wanted me to know about the baby. John's heart sank. He had been so caught up in his own lies, in the whirlwind of his affair with Linda, that he hadn't considered the consequences, the collateral damage his actions would inflict on the people he loved most. He had hurt Mary, betrayed her trust in the most unforgivable way. Mary, he began, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say to justify his actions, to erase the pain he had caused? Mary sank onto the sofa, her body shaking with sobs. John knelt before her, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. He reached out to touch her, but she flinched away, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and disgust. I don't understand, Mary whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Why, John? Why did you do this to us? John hung his head, shame washing over him in waves. I don't know, Mary, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. I was lonely. I missed you. I missed David. He couldn't bring himself to look at her, to face the pain he had inflicted on the woman he loved. Lonely? Mary repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. You were lonely? And what about me, John? What about our son? Did you ever think about us? Of course I did, John protested, lifting his head, his eyes pleading for her understanding. I thought about you both every single day. I wrote you letters, I sent money. Letters filled with lies, John. Mary interrupted, her voice laced with bitterness. Money that couldn't buy back the years you stole from us. She stood up, her gaze hardening. What do you want now, John? Why are you here? John swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I came to see Linda, he admitted, his voice trembling. She sent me a letter. She's threatening to tell everyone, to ruin my career, to take David away from me. Mary's eyes narrowed. Linda? She scoffed. She's calling herself Catherine now, trying to reinvent herself, I guess. But some things you can't outrun, no matter how many times you change your name." She paused, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "And to think I actually felt sorry for her. She told me you were dead, John, that you had died in an accident. I grieved for you, John. I wore black for a year, and all this time, you were living a lie." "She's lying, Mary," John insisted, his voice laced with desperation. "She's trying to manipulate us, to turn us against each other." "Oh, really?" Mary interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Then what about this, John?" She strode towards a small desk in the corner of the room, retrieved a folded piece of paper, and tossed it onto the coffee table. "Go on, read it, John. See for yourself what a stand-up guy you are." John's hand trembled as he unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten agreement, a contract of sorts, signed by both him and Linda. Dated a few months after their first encounter, the words swam before his eyes, blurring together in a dizzying dance of shame and regret. "I, John Miller, agree to father a child with Catherine Williams." John's blood ran cold as he read the words, each phrase a hammer blow to his heart. He remembered that night, the haze of alcohol and desire clouding his judgment. He remembered Linda's seductive whispers, her promises of a future together, her threats if he refused. He remembered signing the paper, his hand shaking, his mind numb. He had been so desperate to escape his loneliness, so caught up in the moment, that he had sacrificed his future, his family, his honor, for a fleeting moment of passion. Mary watched John's face crumple as he read the document, her heart hardening with each passing second. She had known the truth for months, ever since Linda, or Catherine as she now called herself, had shown up on her doorstep, a smug grin on her face, that damning piece of paper clutched in her hand. Mary had been devastated, her world shattered into a million pieces. The man she loved, the man she had built a life with, the father of her child, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And Linda, the woman who had claimed to be her friend, had orchestrated it all, reveling in her pain. But Mary was no fool. As she read the contract, she realized something wasn't right. The language was cold, legalistic, more like a business transaction than an agreement between two people in love. And there was something about Linda's demeanor, a manic glint in her eyes, a forced cheerfulness that masked a deeper, darker emotion that set off alarm bells in Mary's mind. She had confronted Linda, demanding to know the truth. But Linda, her mask of friendliness slipping, had laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that chilled Mary to the bone. "He's all yours, honey," Linda had sneered, tossing the contract onto the table. "Enjoy the leftovers, but don't come crying to me when he screws up again. Once a cheater, always a cheater." Mary had refused to believe her, clinging to the hope that there was more to the story, that John had somehow been coerced, manipulated. But now, seeing the fear and shame etched on his face, the truth was undeniable. John looked up at her, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. "Mary, I don't know what I was thinking," he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. I was messed up back then. The war, it changed me. I wasn't myself." "Don't you dare blame the war for your actions, John," Mary interrupted, her voice cold and sharp. "You made a choice. You chose to betray me, to betray our family. And now you want me to feel sorry for you? To understand?" She took a deep breath, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "What do you want, John?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "Do you want absolution? Do you want me to forgive you? Because that's not going to happen. Not now, not ever." "Mary, please," John pleaded, reaching out to touch her, but she recoiled as if his touch burned. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice venomous. "I don't want anything from you, John, except for you to disappear from my life. Go back to your precious army, to your fancy academy. Pretend we never existed. Pretend David never existed." John's heart shattered into a million pieces. He knew he deserved her anger, her contempt. He had made a series of terrible choices that had irrevocably broken their bond. "But what about Linda?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What about her threats? She's going to ruin me, Mary. She's going to tell everyone." "Let her," Mary said coldly. "You deserve everything she throws at you. Maybe then you'll understand the pain you've caused, the damage you've done." She paused, her gaze locking onto his, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think your precious career is more important than our family? Than your son?" You think being an officer, a teacher, gives you the right to treat people like this? To lie, to cheat, to break promises. You disgust me, John. You disgust me." Mary's words cut through John like a knife. He had been so focused on preserving his own life, his own reputation, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had sacrificed everything for a lie, for a woman who had used him, manipulated him, discarded him like a broken toy. Mary's words echoed in John's ears as he walked away from the house he once considered his home. He had been blind, arrogant, stupid. He had let his desires, his insecurities, his own wounded ego, lead him down a path of destruction. Linda had played him like a fiddle. She had spun a web of lies, manipulating him, using him, feeding his ego, while chipping away at his morals. He had been so blinded by her beauty, by the thrill of the forbidden, that he hadn't seen the truth. He hadn't seen the anger simmering beneath her surface, the bitterness that fueled her actions. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. John had walked in on Linda with another man. Jealousy, rage, a primal urge to possess and control had consumed him. He had lashed out, his anger a violent storm that swept away all reason, all decency. Linda, never one to back down from a fight, had fought back, her own fury a whirlwind of venomous words and calculated cruelty. And the contract? It was her revenge, a carefully crafted weapon designed to destroy him, to strip him of everything he held dear. John's career at West Point was over. The letter arrived a few weeks later, a cold, impersonal document outlining the charges against him. Conduct unbecoming an officer, adultery, assault. He had been stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged, his dreams of a military career shattered into a million pieces. He was a pariah, a disgrace to the uniform he had once worn with pride. John returned to Willow Creek, his pockets empty, his spirit broken. He hadn't dared to face Mary, to beg for her forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. He left a small bundle of cash on their doorstep, a meager attempt to atone for his sins. Desperate for a fresh start, John boarded a Greyhound bus heading south towards the anonymity of the sprawling city. He wandered the bustling streets, a ghost haunting a world that no longer recognized him. The money ran out quickly, and John found himself adrift, his military skills useless in this concrete jungle. The thought of returning to Willow Creek, of facing the whispers and judgment of his former community, filled him with shame. He had disgraced himself, his family, his town. Farming, the only other trade he knew, held no appeal. He couldn't bear the thought of toiling in the fields, a constant reminder of the life he had thrown away. Eventually, John found himself back in Willow Creek, his tail between his legs, his dreams reduced to ashes. He moved back in with his parents, his childhood bedroom a suffocating reminder of his fall from grace. The whispers followed him everywhere. "That's John Miller," people would say, their voices laced with a mixture of pity and contempt. "The one who got kicked out of the army, the one who cheated on his wife, the one who left his son." John became a recluse, hiding from the judging eyes of his former friends and neighbors. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, the burn of whiskey a temporary reprieve from the searing pain of his guilt. He lashed out at anyone who dared to offer advice, his anger a shield against the unbearable truth of his own failings. Mary, meanwhile, had picked up the pieces of her shattered life. She moved back to Willow Creek, taking a teaching job at the local elementary school. She poured her heart into her work, finding solace in the innocent smiles of her students. She was determined to provide a stable, loving home for David, shielding him from the whispers and judgments that followed his father's name. John's parents, heartbroken by their son's downfall, tried to reach out to him, urging him to seek help, to find a way to rebuild his life. But John, trapped in a spiral of self-pity and resentment, pushed them away, his bitterness a wall that separated him from the people who loved him most. Mary's older sister Sarah approached John one day, her voice firm but kind. "John, you need to get yourself together," she said, her eyes filled with concern. "Mary's hurting. David's hurting. You can't just sit here and wallow in your misery. You need to find a job, a purpose. You need to be a man again." John scoffed, his voice laced with bitterness. "What do you suggest, Sarah? Go back to playing soldier? I'm not fit to wear a uniform, let alone lead men. I'm a disgrace." "That's not true, John," Sarah countered, her voice gentle but firm. "You made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But that doesn't define you. You're still the same John I knew growing up, the same John Mary fell in love with. You're just lost. But you can find your way back. You can be a good man again, a good father, a good husband, if you're willing to try. Mary doesn't want anything to do with me, John said, his voice hollow. And who can blame her? I messed everything up. I'm not worthy of her forgiveness. That's for Mary to decide, John, Sarah said. But you can't just give up. You owe it to yourself, to David, to try. There's a construction crew hiring in town. Hard work, honest work. It might do you some good. John hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. Construction work? Him? A former army officer? He couldn't stomach the thought of it. But as the days turned into weeks and his self-pity gave way to a gnawing sense of helplessness, John realized he had no choice. He needed to do something, anything, to break free from the suffocating grip of his despair. He needed to prove to himself, to Mary, that he wasn't a complete failure. He took the job, the physical labor, a welcome distraction from the torment of his thoughts. He worked long hours, pushing himself to exhaustion, trying to outrun the demons that haunted him. But the memories lingered, the guilt a constant weight on his soul. The months that followed were a blur of long days, sleepless nights, and drunken brawls. John found solace in the camaraderie of his fellow construction workers, men who didn't judge him, who didn't know about his past. But the escape was temporary, the solace fleeting. One night, after a particularly heated argument with Mary, John stormed out of his parents' house, his anger a raging fire consuming him from within. He stumbled towards the crossroads, the familiar pull of the bar, the promise of oblivion, beckoning him. Mary tried to move on. She focused on raising David, providing him with the love and stability that John had failed to provide. She kept their small house immaculate, a haven of warmth and normalcy in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. She even started dating again, tentatively at first, then with a growing sense of hope. But John's shadow lingered, a constant reminder of her broken heart, of the dreams they had shared, of the future they had envisioned. She couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her was still waiting for him, hoping against hope that he would one day return, a changed man, ready to make amends. 1 month turned into 2, then 4, then a year. Still no word from John. Mary's parents, worried about their daughter's dwindling spirit, urged her to let go, to move on. "He's not coming back, Mary," her mother said gently, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "You need to accept that. You need to focus on yourself, on David. You deserve to be happy." John's brother Mark, stationed at a military base in Texas, wrote letters filled with news of his life, offering words of encouragement and support. "John's made some bad choices, Mary," he wrote, "but he's still our brother. We can't give up on him. I hope, for his sake and for yours, that he finds a way to redeem himself." But John remained lost in his own darkness, the guilt and shame of his actions weighing him down like an anchor. He had become a ghost, haunting the streets of Willow Creek, a shadow of the man he once was. Then, one rainy night, as Mary was walking home from a parent-teacher meeting, a familiar voice called out her name. "Mary? Is that you?" She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of hope and dread washing over her. Standing in the shadows, his face illuminated by the flickering streetlight, was John. He looked older, thinner, his eyes haunted by a deep sadness.